Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending upon where you're watching from. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I warmly welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine and former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. We give special welcome on this Veterans Day to all present service men and women and all veterans who are with us and to those who are not. We are deeply respectful and respectful of and grateful for your service and celebrate you today and every day. We know that it is our military that protects our freedom, and for that we are beyond grateful. It has been a rough week, that is for sure. We at Jews United for Democracy and Justice started this America at a Crossroads series for a purpose and with a mission. Our purpose and our mission was to bring fact-based, evidence-based information and analysis to our audience. Our purpose and our mission was to honor the rule of law and to elevate democratic ideals. To accomplish that mission, we have brought a cross-section of thinkers from right to left, but never from the extremes, as it would be counter to our mission to amplify extreme, non-fact-based, or undemocratic voices. Our mission was not to advocate for candidates or parties. Now more than ever, we remain committed to that mission and more motivated than ever to continue our work. By our audience's response to our programs and to our emails, we know we have your support in doing so. We will appreciate you connecting as many people as possible to our programs, as we have lots of work to do and need your help to do it. Now down to tonight's business. It is good to be together to begin to gain insight about what happened last week and where we go from here. Thank you to the amazing Ron Brownstein and to tonight's moderator, Warren Olney, for sharing their time, their insights, and their intelligence with us. We want to thank you, our amazing audience, for your response to our request for support, which we emailed last week. Many thanks to those of you who have so generously sent donations to help us fund next year's programming. Of course, if you hadn't yet had a chance to donate, there is a donation link in every email. We are very appreciative not only of your financial support, which sustains this programming, but also of your generous notes of appreciation. As of next week, we are going back to our Wednesday, once a week, 5 p.m. Pacific programming. But this week, in addition to tonight's program, we also have a program at 5 p.m. on Wednesday. Our guest this Wednesday will be Jason Tatenhove, former member of and former spokesperson for the far-right paramilitary group, the Oath Keepers, whose members were involved in the January 6th insurrection. Jason testified against the Oath Keepers before the House Select Committee on the January 6th insurrection. Jason will be in conversation with Larry Mantle on the ominous but important topic, the perils of extremism, how I left the Oath Keepers, and why we should be worried about another civil war. Quite the topic for our times. The following Wednesday, November 20th, we welcome former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, now of Stanford University, with political sociologist Larry Diamond, also of Stanford, who will discuss how the election will impact Ukraine, the Middle East, and U.S. foreign relations, a critical topic to cover and to understand. There will be no program the week of Thanksgiving, but we have an amazing December and January planned, so stay tuned. I will be abroad for the next two programs, but will return for the December 4th program. In my absence, my colleague Zev Yaroslavsky will be hosting this Wednesday and next week. I look forward to listening and watching both programs after the fact. Again, wishing all of you a happy Thanksgiving. I believe strongly that feeling and expressing gratitude is very important in keeping a positive attitude toward the future. I have found that gratitude breeds hope and empowers our most optimistic angels. With hope comes a strengthening of our resolve to continue to fight the good fight. Together we can do this, and we will. Now to tonight's program. Warren Olney is well known to our audience. He has spent his life in broadcast journalism, having won many prizes for his excellent investigations and reporting over the years. We are honored by his service to America at a Crossroads. Warren, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Janice. Great to be here as always. And of course, it's wonderful to have as a guest on this program, Ron Brownstein, an old friend and a very valued contributor to journalism for a very long period of time. Ron Brownstein, senior editor at The Atlantic. He's senior political analyst for CNN. He worked previously for the Los Angeles Times and the National Journal. He's written 7 books, most recently a New York Times bestseller with a somewhat unlikely sounding title, Rock Me on the Water, 1974, subtitled The Year Los Angeles Transformed Music and Movies and Television and Politics. Ron is also a 2-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for the coverage of presidential campaigns, and he is here for what we call a post-mortem on the most recent presidential campaign, and to help answer the question, where do we go from here now that the election is over? Ron, welcome as always. Great to have you with us.
Hey, Warren, good to be here.
Okay, so you've been looking at
by
the
the way,
numbers. We want to talk about how we got here before we talk
yeah,
about what's next.
yes.
What have you found so far that distinguishes this campaign, particularly from what happened in 2020?
The most shocking thing about this campaign is how normal it was. Donald Trump is anything but a normal candidate, right? I mean, he is someone who I think is outside of the mainstream of our democratic tradition to an extent that's been unmatched. I mean, I don't think there's been the leader of a major faction within a party that has been as much as dubious and as much of a threat to American constitutional democracy as we have known it since John Calhoun before the Civil War. So Trump is anything but a normal candidate. But in the dynamics of this election, the electorate responded in a shockingly normal way. I mean, the hydraulics of the American two-party system is that when voters are dissatisfied with conditions in the country, they break for the party that is not in the White House. And we saw some remarkably similar patterns to what we have seen through history in this election. I mean, 70% of voters said the economy was in bad shape, fair or poor. We can argue about whether that was justified. I would say it is justified in that people are making that judgment primarily based on inflation, not on the job market or the stock market. But be that as it may, 70% said the economy was in bad shape, and 70% of them voted for Trump. 60% of voters said they disapproved of Biden's performance. This is the key number. And 82% of them voted for Trump. You do the math there. That's roughly 49.2% of the electorate, which is where Trump is probably going to end up, somewhere at about 49.5, 49.7 something percent of the vote. There is just, there were voters have not all the voters have not basically erased all of their doubts about Trump. A majority of voters said they thought he was too extreme in the exit polls or the vote count. By the way, what I'm using here are the two major sources of data on how people voted. There's one thing, the exit polls that are done by Edison Research for a consortium of media organizations. And then there's the competing product VoteCast, which is done by the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago for a different set of media organizations. They're kind of Coke and Pepsi, but this time they converged and are telling almost exactly the same story with very little difference between them. And what they tell us is a majority of voters said they thought Trump was too extreme. A majority of voters said they worried that Trump would steer the country toward authoritarianism. A majority of voters opposed mass deportation. A majority of voters said they wanted abortion to remain legal. Two of my favorites. A majority of voters said they want the federal government to be doing more to ensure access to health care. And in what is maybe the greatest irony of all, 50% of voters, compared to only like 30% who took the opposite position, said the government should be doing more to ensure that kids are vaccinated against childhood diseases, which is not the outcome they're going to get with RFK Jr. kind of, parading around the White House. But in each case, a significant slice, really a decisive slice of voters who held those views either contrary to Trump's positions or negative on him voted for him anyway. A quarter of women who describe themselves as pro-choice voted for Trump. A quarter of Latinos who said they opposed mass deportation voted for Trump. 1 in 8 people who said he was too extreme or that he would steer the country toward authoritarianism voted for Trump. And the common thread in all of that is that these are voters who are deeply discontented with the economy. And, as I wrote last week, an unpredictable future seemed to these voters less of a risk than an unacceptable present. And this is not unique. I mean, this is not unique. I mean, there is simply no precedent for a president's party holding the White House when the country is this discontented with the way things are going in the country. Whether it's the incumbent himself running for re-election, as you know, Jimmy Carter in 1980 had an approval rating about what we saw for Biden. Reagan won. 92, H.W. Bush, approval rating comparable. Trump himself in 2020. What's less recognized is it's not only if the incumbent president is running for re-election, even if the incumbent president chooses to or is forced to by the two-term limit to step aside. In the cases we have where you have an incumbent president facing this level of disapproval, Truman in 52, LBJ in 68, George W. Bush in 08, his party lost the White House in those elections as well. Now, there are a lot of reasons why you can look at this and say it should have been different with Trump, what I started with. He is not a normal candidate. And yet, in many ways, this election ran down the normal grooves, the familiar grooves of a referendum, a negative referendum on the performance of a president leading to the other side. One more stat, of the voters, just to give you how remarkably normal this was. Again, that's kind of abnormal, but in 2008, 62% of people who said the country was on the wrong track voted for Barack Obama, who was the party out of the White House, right? 2016, 68% of people who said the country was on the wrong track voted for Trump. He was the party out of the White House. This time, after January 6th, 90-something criminal indictments, adjudicated for sexual abuse, adjudicated for financial fraud, found guilty of 34 felony counts, 62% of wrong track voters voted for Trump. So, as in Casablanca, the fundamental things apply, and they outweighed the unique characteristics of Trump for enough of the electorate for him to win. And we can talk about what happened in the swing states versus there's another part of this story, but I don't want to filibuster on you. But that is the core story. Like that voters responded in the kind of familiar hydraulic way. One party goes down, the other one, by definition, in a two-party system has to go up. And Democrats, with reasonable cause, looked at 2022 and said, well, that relationship was broken with Trump. It didn't have to follow that pattern with Trump. And then, in fact, it did follow it more than I think most people anticipated.
So you say the two-party system. You said that Trump was getting 49.7% of the vote, something like that. Does that mean that Biden got more, or is it
Biden
the third party that?
No, Biden got more than Trump. Trump, Biden got to 51.7 or 8. I mean, Trump is now at 50.5, but with California counting, it'll go down. One thing that's really striking here, Warren, is that the exit polls and the vote cast are the first rough draft of history, as we say, of journalism. There are subsequent studies, particularly one done by the Pew Research Center and by a Democratic targeting group called Catalyst, that are considered a little more authoritative. But it is striking. The electorate tilted more Republican and more white than in 2020. Okay, we have not had, if this holds up, it'll be the first time, I'm sure, since the 70s when the electorate got more white over a 4-year period, because obviously whites are shrinking as a share of the overall population, and their share of the electorate has been steadily declining as well. But if you go apples to apples, exit poll in 2020 to exit poll in 24, or vote cast in 2020 to vote cast in 2024, apples to apples in each case, the electorate got more white, and it got significantly more Republican. In fact, in the exit poll, which is the one that goes back further into the 70s, this was the biggest advantage in Republican identification they've ever had in the exit polls. Republicans were 4 points more of the voters than Democrats, according to the exit polls, and I think they were 4 points more in the vote cast as well. And that says that there were a lot of people who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 who did not come back and vote again in 2024. And there's going to be a lot of debate about why that happened. I mean, the two principal theories are either they were not sufficiently alarmed about Trump as they were 4 years ago, and we can talk about that, or they didn't feel like they got what they anticipated out of the Biden administration when they came out and voted for him 4 years ago. Again, looking at the exit polls among returning voters, it was basically an even split between how many voted for Biden and how many voted for Trump in 2020, where, in point of fact, Biden won by 4.5 points. And that means a lot of his voters did not come back.
When you say that there's disapproval and let's take that apart. What does disapproval mean? Is it just about the economy, or are there other issues that are also in play? And if so, what are they?
Well, I think it's predominantly the economy. Again, using these data sources, 46% of people in the exit poll said they were worse off than 4 years ago. I mean, that,
Wow.
by the way, I will say, I thought Kamala Harris ran a great campaign. I thought she made, she had the one big error on The View where she couldn't articulate any way she'd be different than
Yeah.
Biden, but she stepped up at every big set piece moment. Her first speech, her convention speech, the debate, the ellipse speech, the whole general final week. 46% of the country saying they were worse off than 4 years ago. You are dealing with a very slim margin for error as the candidate. I think that was the biggest thing by far, but obviously there's a lot of disapproval on the border. As I said, a majority opposed mass deportation. A majority does support much more security on the border, making it tougher to apply for asylum. And I think there was concern about crime. Now, Biden, if you're Biden, you could say all of these things were getting better, and they were. I mean, inflation was being squeezed out of the system. Border encounters are way down. Crime has peaked and is declining. But the conditions of the first couple of years of his presidency is probably when this was decided. And in particular, the big run up in prices in 21 and 22. And as you probably saw, a columnist from the Financial Times this week pointed out there's a think tank called ParlGov, which has compiled a database of elections over the last 120 years in all the major democracies. And this was the first time over the course of that database where every ruling party lost ground, either lost seats or lost power. The common experience of inflation. In many ways, and this is something I'm kind of thinking about now, so I'm kind of working it out with you as we talk. But I think 2022 was critical in that it sent a false signal to Democrats, right? Because what happened, if you look at what happened in 2022, it was similar to what happened this year in one respect and very different in another respect. Here's what was similar. In 2022, in all of the states, whether they were blue states or red states, where the parties really weren't competing, Republicans improved. They basically rode the wave of widespread discontent with the economy and Biden. And that was true in Florida and Ohio, and it was true in California and New York. But and that again happened again this year, as you saw. I mean, New Jersey and New York got better for Trump, and Texas and Florida got better for Trump. 49 of the 50 states got better for Trump. But what happened? What was the other thing that happened in 22? What happened in 22, and by the way, Republicans in 2022 won the national popular vote in all the House races combined, much as they did the presidential popular vote this year. But in 2022, Democrats were able basically to build a moat around the swing states. And in the swing states, even though economic dissatisfaction was as high as it was everywhere else, Democrats were able to focus enough voters on all the unique vulnerabilities of the Trump era GOP: democracy, extremism, abortion. And while Democrats were doing worse, in both California and Texas, where people really weren't having competitive statewide races, they won the governorships in Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the Senate races in Georgia and Arizona and Pennsylvania. They were able to isolate, kind of quarantine the swing states from what was happening everywhere else amid this generalized discontent with Biden. And I think many Democrats believed, and I certainly believed, I'll put myself on the list of people who believed that it was possible to do that again in 2024. That, as I wrote right before the election, Trump was certainly going to do better in the popular vote than he did in 2020. and probably better than he did in 2016, because you can't have this level of discontent with the outgoing president and the other party not get a lot of votes. But I thought that as in 2022, Democrats could kind of wall off Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin in particular, maybe not the Sun Belt states, but certainly those three, and hold them narrowly, even if they diminished in the national popular vote. Well, that worked to an extent, right? I mean, the final movement in the vote from 2020 to 2024 on a national basis is going to be like 6 or 6.25 or 6.5 points toward Trump, from a 4.5 point Biden win to a 1.5 point or 1.75 point Trump win. So we moved about 6 or 6.25 points. The swing states didn't move nearly as much. They moved, especially Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, they only moved about 3 points toward Trump. So everything that Harris did in those states, the advertising, the organizing, the door knocking, all the people who made phone calls, people on this call who made calls into Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, it's not that it had zero effect. It did. It had an effect, but it could not overcome the magnitude of the shift. I thought the shift in the national waterline, like maybe just stop here for 1 second and say the way to think about presidential elections is the national vote is a waterline. And every state has an intrinsic relation to the waterline. And I wrote the week before, and I think the math will bear out, that if Harris won the popular vote by as much as Clinton did in 2016, she would have been able to win Michigan and Pennsylvania, even though Clinton lost them. And I think the results tell us that was probably true, but she didn't win the popular vote by as much as Clinton did in 2016. It got even worse. It got to a negative. And even though the swing states were a little better than the country overall, they weren't better enough. So, as I said, in 2020, the big difference between 2022 and 2024 is that in 2022, Democrats were able to quarantine the swing states and do a lot better in them than they did nationally. I mean, Gretchen Whitmer won big, Josh Shapiro won big, John Fetterman won pretty big, Tony Evers in Wisconsin won big, Mark Kelly won big. This time, she also did a little bit better in the swing states, but not nearly as much. And it wasn't enough to overcome this kind of, sinking tide, lowering tide, sinking all boats, including the states she needed to get to 270.
Democrats are arguing, and I'm sure they'll be arguing for a long time about what they might have done differently. The what if, of course, is always very important, particularly to the losers. Was the dissatisfaction so huge, do you think, that no other candidate could have defeated Trump? Or if the Democrats had appointed perhaps they had a primary, as some people suggested they should have done when Biden got out of it, particularly if he'd gotten out sooner. If another candidate had been nominated who wasn't so closely identified with the Biden administration as to be the vice president, could that person possibly have had a better chance than Kamala Harris?
So I'll start at the bottom line. As I said earlier, there's no precedent for the president's party holding the White House at this level of discontent. Yeah. So I don't think anybody could have won. You could make a case that someone who was further away, a governor, might have established a little more separation, but I'm not sure they would have been as good a candidate. I thought she was she had trouble articulating an economic vision that responded to the concerns voters had about Biden. And she certainly gave that one very bad answer on The View. But overall, no one could have asked for anything more from her. I mean, she energized a Democratic coalition that was moribund. She excited donors and activists, and she stood up and delivered at all of the big moments. I just think the history of this is pretty clear. And really, the other thing that happened that we should talk about is, Trump voters retrospectively normalized Trump, and Democrats really, and the media didn't do enough to challenge that. I remember thinking, and later writing in the fall, but in the summer of 2023, the AARP has this polling project they do in swing states and swing districts, the senior lobby. Yeah. And they hired Trump's pollster, Tony Fabrizio's company, and at the time, Biden's pollster, John Anzalone's company. And they've been doing all these polls, like in different states. And in Warren, in the summer, August, I think it was August of 2023, they polled the 40 most competitive congressional districts. And they found that Trump's retrospective job approval was at 48%. And Biden's current approval in the districts was like a 41, 42, which is like, that was the first time I had seen that. And like my ears just went like, and what we saw throughout 2024 was, and especially in the fall of 2024, was that voters' retrospective assessment of Trump's presidency was rising to levels that he had never actually achieved while he was president. Okay. And you say, well, how can that be? I think the answer is they were looking at his presidency now through the lens of what they didn't like about Biden's, about the idea that the cost of living was more affordable, the border was more secure. In some cases, they felt more safe. You know, I think you and I have talked. I know I have talked about this on a previous edition of this great session that we do.
Yeah.
But what I described as the nightmare phrase that every Democratic pollster will tell you is in every focus group they would do with non-white men, Black or Hispanic men. Someone in the course of the focus group would say, yeah, he's a racist. Yeah, he disrespects women. Yeah, he's crude. But if I'm telling the truth, I had more money in my pocket when he was president. And the dynamic that we saw through 24 was that voters were remembering Trump's presidency primarily through the idea that gas and groceries were cheaper. And all of the factors that kept his approval rating from ever reaching 50% when they were actually living through that economy were fading in their mind, right? And, the media played a role in that. Democrats played a role in that. The super PACs that raised hundreds of $millions for Biden and Harris, they focused initially entirely on trying to boost Biden and then Harris, and they did not kind of drive home, everything about Trump. And so you got on election day, and I think it was the VoteCast, he had like a 48, 49% retrospective job approval, whereas Biden's was like 40 and 41. Like, how is Harris supposed to win in that environment? I mean, it's like the things that people disliked about Trump kind of faded, and what they remembered was this idea that pre-pandemic life was more affordable. But as I said, all this other stuff hasn't completely gone away. A majority said he's too extreme. A majority said he will steer the country toward authoritarianism. But for people who held those views, but not strongly, the cross-cutting pressure of the economy and maybe the border to some extent was just too powerful. And you get these dynamics, like, again, comparing 22 to 24. In 2022, 80% plus of people who describe themselves as pro-choice voted for Whitmer in Michigan and Shapiro in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, and about 3/4 of people who describe themselves as pro-choice voted for Tony Evers in Wisconsin. This time, only about 2/3 of pro-choice voters voted for Harris in each of those states. And that's obviously the difference between winning and losing. And more of those voters who said they wanted abortion to remain legal voted on other concerns, primarily the economy, I think. And, when we were able to kind of disaggregate this a little more, we can answer that more affirmatively or definitively. But I think pretty clearly there were 1/4 of Latinos who said they opposed mass deportation voted for Trump. I mean, they may have thought, okay, he's not talking about me, he's only talking about the new arrivals. But there were a lot of people who still had hesitations about Trump, who, as I said, thought the greater risk was continuing on the road we're on than kind of leaping into the unknown with him.
I want to go back to what you said about the media and the presentation of Trump and the way that the campaign was reported. You said that people perhaps were less alarmed about Trump and what might be wrong with him than they were in 2020. I'm wondering why that would be. And does that have something to do with what was referred to as sane washing and the effort to sort of normalize Trump and the coverage of Trump, even though his campaign rhetoric this time around was certainly more extreme, more disturbing, and in many cases, impossible to even understand if you tried to parse it. Did that have no impact at all, or do people not get it? Are they not really looking at the same? Is everybody not looking at the same media? To what extent does that have a role here with the fragmentation of media and the movement away from the traditional media and into onto the internet?
So if I was going to rank them, as I said, I think the biggest factor was that people were remembering his presidency primarily through the lens of what they didn't like about Biden's. And the all of that I think was really important. And related to that was again something that you heard a lot as a reporter, which was, well, he was president for 4 years and we got through it, like barely, of course, with January 6th. But like one woman, a woman who runs a group called Galvanize Action, which studies white women, that's what it does, said to me that even when she would play clips of Trump this year saying he's going to do something extreme, like, mass deportation, the women in our focus groups would say, it's just campaign talk. I don't believe it. They wanted to vote for him, as she put it, they wanted to vote for him because they thought they were going to get economic benefits out of him returning to the White House. And they did not want to let any cognitive dissonance, challenge that. They wanted to vote for him because they thought they would be better off. They thought their life would be more affordable and more secure. And so they discounted information to the contrary. I think those were the biggest. I think, to me, the biggest factor is that like people were viewing Trump primarily through the lens of prices. I think that was the biggest factor. But yes, I mean, I think the media kind of had a mixed performance in terms of, how it portrayed Trump. But, as we see in exit polling and other polling, people who read newspapers voted for Harris like 3-1. And I think even people who watch the local news regularly voted for Harris. I mean, Trump's strength is among people who are somewhat or very detached from, media as we, it's more of a podcast kind of
And is that more true now than it was in 2020?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. But again, the other thing that's, the thing that's presidential elections are more than any other influenced by the reality of your day-to-day life. I mean, people are making a big judgment about the state of conditions in the country. If all of these media trends were in place and we had not had the 20% run up in prices in 21 and 22, and Biden was more, capable of articulating a message and so forth, and it was I don't think the changes in media consumption can explain this. I think something this big, where Trump improved, Warren, in 90% of the counties in America, his vote share improved from 2020. Okay, that includes thousands of counties where no one spent a dime, that suggests to me that we are looking at something, a broad national verdict, like 1980, Carter Reagan, 2008, after Bush, we're going in a different direction. When you get something this big, to me, it kind of squashes tactical considerations or what ifs. Like, I thought you should have picked Josh Shapiro. Turned out, wouldn't have mattered. If they had nominated Gretchen Whitmer, it just seems too big to be, if Teddy Kennedy had beaten Carter in 1980, could he have beaten Ronald Reagan with, 75% wrong track? Like you can do the what ifs forever, but when you have 90% of the counties in the country moving in the same direction, it tells you you're looking at a common national experience. There's a terrific, there's a thing called the Daily Yonder, which is a website that covers rural America. It's put out by a think tank called the Center for Rural America. And they have a classification system that sorts the counties, all the counties in the country, from the most urban to the most rural, along 6, like major urban cities, their suburbs, and small cities, their suburbs, smaller cities, and then rural. And the movement toward Trump in this election was almost identical across all 6 categories. The only other election that was like that they've had, where it kind of moved about the same amount everywhere, was 2020, when they all moved a little bit toward Biden. And that to me kind of like that's kind of like a master key to what we are seeing here. You don't get that consistency of movement through tactics or messages. You get it through everybody kind of living through the same thing. And there being a broad national verdict that Biden did not deliver the results that people wanted or expected. And part of that is him and his ability to drive a message and all that. But that's how you get this consistent national shift. And I think that's what we saw. And by the way, that's why, I mean, there was an ideological reshuffling of the states in 2016. I think in these last two elections, working within that basic template, we've seen a performance-based move toward the Democrats and a performance-based move back toward the Republicans, with a little ideological realignment overlay, maybe among Latino men and possibly Black men. But the magnitude of this suggests to me that if Trump doesn't deliver what people expect, you could certainly see a shift back in 2026 and 2028.
What about, we hear so much about the idea that the Democrats are no longer perceived as being the party of the working class, but rather of an elite. How much does that have to do, or does that show up in the numbers that you're looking at?
It does, yeah. I mean, it does. I mean, Democrats are struggling among voters without a college degree. Interestingly, again, now this is one where I think the story being told by the exit polls and the vote casts, it's hard for me to imagine that it's fully correct given what we were seeing in the geographic trends I just mentioned to you. But both of the exits and the vote cast do not show any meaningful movement among white voters overall. I mean, a tiny decline among white voters without a college education, what you're talking about, offset by a scintilla of increase among college educated whites, although not as much as you would have expected from in general resistance to Trump. They were not immune to the discontent either. The big movement in this election was among non-white voters, and mostly non-white voters without a college degree, mostly men, but also Hispanic women moved. Hispanic men moved the most, Black men moved, Hispanic women moved, and they were all working class voters. Now, the longer term question is this primarily a realignment based on cultural affinity for kind of Trumpism and strongman, and all of his efforts to appeal to men, and the sense that Democrats are too culturally liberal? I am sure there was some of that, but I think the biggest piece of that is that a lot of these are voters living paycheck to paycheck, and voters living paycheck to paycheck were feeling really hammered by the inflation of the last few years. And of course, even though inflation has basically been squeezed out of the system, prices are not back to where they were. I mean, that run up of 21 and 22 is not undone. And, the way that the medicine was as painful for many people as the disease, right? Because the high interest rates made it really hard to do anything, buy a car, buy a house. They obviously affect rents. So yes, I do think Democrats have to worry that part of what we saw, I think, especially among Latino men who have been culturally conservative for a number of years, but there's been sort of a social restriction on voting Republican that's now kind of shattered, where culturally conservative Latino men who might have agreed more with Republicans than Democrats on a lot of things still voted Democratic because it just wasn't acceptable. That's gone. And the Republican floor among Latino men is probably higher than it used to be. I'll wait and see before I say that about Black men. But I think the biggest thing that happened is that these voters were really, the share of Latino voters and the share of non-college white voters who described the economy in negative terms was even higher than the country overall, certainly higher than college white voters who, Democrats had the double advantage. They weren't quite as economically discontented. They were more receptive to the arguments about democracy and rights, but even they were really discontented about the economy. And, Harris won them, but her vote among them didn't grow. I mean, if you remember, I wrote a piece, I was out in Michigan about 10 days before the election, and you could see what I described as maybe, in an unusually apt turn of phrase, Trump's pincer movement. Like Trump was likely going to improve even further in Trump country, small town and rural America. He wasn't running against a 77-year-old white guy anymore. He was running against a mixed race woman who had taken some very liberal positions on social issues. So he was likely going to do even better there. And I thought he was going to crack the Democratic hold on the inner city, that he was going to do at least a little better in heavily Black and Latino areas of Philadelphia and Detroit, as he did. But what seemed to me that was possible for her and necessary, not only possible, but necessary, was that she could offset this by running even better than Biden did in the white collar, racially diverse, prosperous inner suburbs, right? So Oakland County, Michigan, Kent County, Michigan, the WOW counties in outside of Milwaukee, the four collar counties outside of Philadelphia, Montgomery, Delaware, Chester, and Bucks. And she didn't. She basically lost, as I said before, she lost ground. She lost about the same amount of ground there that she did in the other. She lost about the same amount of ground everywhere. And so, if I remember thinking Joe Biden won Philadelphia, the four suburban counties outside of Philadelphia, and Allegheny, which is Pittsburgh, by 910,000 votes. Trump won everything else by 830 in 2020. I thought she was going to have to win those by 950 to win. And she won them by 750. And that's how you lose.
Let me give the audience a chance to chime in here. Bob wants to know this. Was there anything the Democrats could have done to change the general perception of the economy or to convince people that Trump's policies would make prices even higher, as a lot of people were saying, particularly with regard to tariffs?
Yeah, no, look, they tried. Tariffs and basically every economic analysis that's been done, and most of them by Wall Street firms. I mean, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Moody's have concluded that Trump's agenda, and particularly the tariffs and the mass deportation and extending the Trump tax cuts, is going to be inflationary. That inflation will be higher under Trump over the next 4 years than it would have been under Harris. It's just very hard to get people to look forward in that way when, in their own recent experience, they were like, wait a minute, they feel like things were less expensive when he was president than when the Democrats were president. So to convince them that looking forward, that's going to reverse is just a very hard case to make.
Okay. Diana from Westwood wants to know about gender and race. What is the role of anti-female, i.e. sentiments that women are not capable or not wanting another Black president?
Yeah, I think the gender was more than the race. First of all, we were anticipating this, enormous gender gap, which again, we didn't get. I mean, Harris did not run as well. We have the two data sources, VoteCast and exit polls. She did not run as well among women, not only as Biden did, but as Hillary Clinton did in 2016. I mean, both data sources had her winning women by about 7 or 8 points and losing men by somewhere between 10 and 12 points, which is not an especially large gender gap. She did a little worse than Biden on both fronts. But I do think that, as in 2016, there is a critical segment of non-college white women, non-college white men, and Hispanic and Black men who are reluctant to make a woman president. I mean, I think there's just a lot of evidence that they think a man is stronger and is more likely to keep them safe. And you can talk to radio hosts or people who do focus groups or pollsters, and they will talk about the various ways. People will say, well, it's okay with me, but I don't think my neighbor will, which is always the tip off. or, I'm okay with it, but I don't think foreign leaders will respect her. Yeah. And especially given that Trump, ran on such a reassertion of traditional gender roles. I mean, childless cat ladies, Hulk Hogan ripping off his shirt. I will be your protector, whether you like it or not. And again, I thought all of that there was an audience for that among blue collar white women, but that all of that would drive Harris further ahead among single women and younger women and college women. And she did fine with all of those groups, but she didn't do better. And I think with some of them, she did worse. I mean, they were living in the same economy as everybody else. And all of that cultural resistance to Trump did not trump this sense of like they did not want to keep going down this road.
We talked a bit about the media before, but I'm told that many viewers want to know this. How significant was the disinformation and misinformation that was put out by the right-wing press and by the MAGA candidate himself? Is it possible to know from the statistics that you've looked at what role that played?
I don't have a great handle on that, but I think one thing I said is a tip off to that, which is that voters who mostly got their information from social media were the most pro-Trump of anything in the electorate. And, there have been warning calls, warning despair cries from groups that work with Black and Latino Democrats all year about how much sludge was being pumped into their social media feeds from Trump and his allies. And obviously, Musk has made Twitter X into an absolute cesspool of kind of white nationalist racism. I think it definitely had an effect. I mean, and that is something that is a real long-term problem for Democrats, figuring out how to talk to young men in particular. As I said, young women who are not getting this as directly were also, did not rally around Harris to the extent that polls suggested they might. I think, those would be the people. I mean, like we'll have to look at it, but like the electorate was more Republican than 2020 and really more Republican than it's been at any point, I mean, and so is that because like Gallup has found Republican identification rising? That's probably part of it. But I think you have to look at this no matter what group we're talking about. The results skew a little toward Trump because the Democratic part of that group did not show up in the same numbers as the Republican part of that group, like single women, for example.
Okay, a lot of people want to get to the question of where do we go from here? We haven't had a lot of time to talk about that. And of course, the president-elect is doing a lot of different things than he did the first time around by pumping out a lot of appointments being announced today, including some people that whose names we all recognize very well, like Mr. Miller, for example. What do you think about given what we've seen so far coming out of the Trump White House? Particularly the potential request to the Republicans in the Senate to sort of take a recess and allow recess appointments to take effect immediately, so you don't have to go through the senatorial confirmation process. Does that have a chance? Are the Republican leaders in the Senate likely to go along with that?
Well, I look at that, as just Trump won the popular vote this time, right? And Trump crushed all dissent in the Republican Party in the spring. And whatever restraints he felt the first time, or whatever restraints that Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan tried to impose on him the first time because they did not win the popular vote, they are all gone. I mean, they are gone. I wrote often this year, what message would Trump take if he proposes a militarized mass deportation, which he promised repeatedly would be the large, which was his centerpiece domestic proposal.
Yeah.
I mean, right?
Nobody had ever seen before.
No, right. He's promising it's going to be bigger than anything anybody has ever seen, and he improved his vote among Latino voters, like significantly. So, how much constraint is he going to feel? How loud is anybody in the Republican Party going to get in warning that this is a dangerous path in terms of the endangering this improvement they've seen among Latino voters? Democrats were afraid to challenge this. Harris didn't challenge it. Ruben Gallego didn't challenge it. The advocacy groups organizing in Nevada and Arizona didn't challenge it. They were afraid that if they went out against mass deportation, it would look like they were being soft on the border, which people wanted the border to be. Clearly, people want the border to be more secure, stable, and kind of less chaotic. But they didn't feel they could draw a line. So no one felt they could challenge him. And he ends up winning this remarkably high percentage of Latino voters while pledging, you know, mass deportation. And then Tom Homan, you know, who he just announced as the border czar, and now Steve Miller, Deputy White House Chief of Staff, the night of the Madison Square Garden rally, when everyone was focused on the joke about Puerto Rico, Tom Homan went on 60 Minutes and was asked, you know, there are a lot of US citizen children here with one or more undocumented parents. How are you going to avoid family separation in your mass deportation plan? And Tom Homan said, we're going to deport the kids too. Okay, you know, Tom Homan is now in charge of immigration.
But
So
don't the
we'll-
kids have, if they're born in this country, don't they have?
They are citizens. Yes.
Yeah.
Tom Homan said, we're going to deport them because their parents created the problem by having them while they were here illegally. So in theory, you know, the Supreme Court might say, no, you can't do that. But that will require two out of the other. I mean, Alito, Gorsuch, and Thomas are probably not going to say no to Trump on anything. So like you would sit here, both of us would sit here and say, there's no way you can deport US citizen minors because they are part of that sentence. They are US citizens. But that will, you know, you could say there's no way a president could be held, giving complete immunity from criminal prosecution. It's, you know, if five Supreme Court justices say he can do it, he can do it. So I think, as a way of answering your question, on every possible front, he is going to push to the max. And he's going to push procedurally to the max. He is going to push legally to the max. Jim Banks, a Republican senator from Indiana, was on CNN this week. He said, we have a mandate to deport every undocumented immigrant. And he has a lot of unilateral authority to do that. He has a lot of unilateral authority to impose his tariffs. He has a lot of authority to do the changes he wants to do in environmental regulation with Lee Zeldin now. Lee Zeldin was talking about energy production.
Lee Zeldin is a Congress member who's got an appointment to be head of the EPA.
Right. His appointment statement to be head of the EPA, he talked about energy production. I mean, they feel like, you know, with reason, they want no Republican has won the popular vote since George W. Bush in 2004. He was a sitting president. Now, Trump may not win a majority of the popular vote by the time it's all said and done. He might be under 50%, but still, I do not think he's going to feel any constraint. I think he is going to push in every direction. I think Democrats are really uncertain about how to respond to this. I mean, all the Latino advocacy groups are going to be like lining up in front of the door of Democratic senators to say, you have to stop this. After their constituencies help deliver him the votes to do this, to enable them to, and the same thing, like, with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is talking about taking fluoride out of the water. He's talking about undermining vaccines. What's going to happen to mifepristone with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as the uber czar of the FDA and CDC? 1/4 of pro-choice women, as I said, voted for Trump. Okay, they're now going to get RFK Jr. functionally making decisions about the availability of abortion medication. So how do Democrats respond to this? I don't know. I mean, these voters voted to enable these policies. And maybe the wiser political course is to let them experience these policies in a way.
Back to the mass deportations, though. It's been made. The point has been made again and again and again. He doesn't have enough people to do it. The number of people that he's talking about, there's not enough enforcement officers. Governors, and particularly Democratic governors, are saying you can't have the National Guard. We're not going to allow it to be used for that purpose. Does he go to police departments? How's he going to do it?
Well, Stephen Miller, in multiple interviews said they will.
Stephen Miller, who has been appointed to be the deputy chief of staff.
And his premier immigration advisor, Santa Monica, High.
Right.
Stephen Miller has said we're going to requisition the National Guard from red states and send them into blue states. He has said that explicitly. And we're going to partner with local sheriffs, and we're going to requisition law enforcement from other federal agencies, DEA, FBI. Now, we'll see whether even Trump has the stomach to take the National Guard from Indiana and send them door to door on the west side of Chicago. which is what Stephen Miller has explicitly said they will do. But between Miller and Homan, they are going to push the envelope. You can be sure they are going to push the envelope. And again, that's just one front. That was probably his signature domestic policy idea. But he says he wants to require every police department in the country to implement stop and frisk or else lose their federal law enforcement dollars, which is going to be an interesting kind of news to all of those younger black men who voted for him and are, based on the New York experience, right in the crosshairs of that kind of policy. So, there are many fronts. You noted before, Warren, not only his rhetoric was more extreme, but his agenda was more extreme. Yeah. 2020 or 2016, like up and down. And I think he is going to feel pretty empowered to pursue it.
What about we haven't talked about foreign affairs at all. Elise Stefanik has been appointed now as a UN ambassador before we have a Secretary of State. How important is that? And what conclusion do you draw from it?
Well, I think the one conclusion you can make from the appointments is it's going to be absolute loyalists. There's going to be no power center. I mean, even Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley, who kind of Haley, who just kind of humiliated herself after Trump, insulted her husband.
Yeah, they've specifically said he has today that they will not be part of the government.
So it's going to be loyalists everywhere. I mean, I wonder, Marco Rubio thought he was going to be Secretary of State, probably, which is why he was kind of so slavish toward Trump. But, Marco Rubio voted to affirm Biden's victory in 2020, so I think it's going to be a very loyalist administration that is not going to have a lot of competing power centers, that is going to put enormous pressure on Ukraine to make a deal with Putin that ends up with him, holding a significant piece of what he's conquered already. I think that, it's going to be a lot of leeway for Netanyahu to execute this war as he sees fit. I think there's going to be enormous pressure on the U.S. relationship with Europe. I think he is going to do across-the-board tariffs, including larger ones on China. Presidents do what they said they would do unless they are stopped. And right now, it's not clear what's going to stop him on, not every front. I mean, unless they end the filibuster, there are limits to what they can do in the Senate. I mean, that will pretty much be limited to the reconciliation bill, which will allow them to extend the Trump tax cuts and the enhanced ACA subsidies, et cetera. But he will move till he gets stopped. And
very quickly, what about Elon Musk and his involvement in the choosing of the appointees? Apparently, he's there in Mar-a-Lago working with the president or the president-elect at the moment. If given the potential for conflict there, when he has tens of billions of dollars in government contracts, that's right out in the open. It's corruption writ large.
This is Putin-esque. I mean, this is Putin oligarchy-esque. Probably the signal, the straw in the wind was Jeff Bezos, kind of cutting his deal even before the election. Yeah. But I think you will see an integration of the instrument of government to punish and reward those who are and are not on the boat, on the team, to an extent that is only comparable to what you have seen in other autocratic systems.
And what about the potential for punishing the media if, in fact, they begin to be critical and say the kinds of things you've been saying?
Yeah, but we will see, right? I mean, can he really use the FCC? Certainly, media mergers and all of that are going to be like Trump. The country has elected someone who, as I said when we started, has less commitment to the American constitutional system of any leader of a major faction in one of our national parties, I believe, than John Calhoun in the years before the Civil War with his theories of concurrent majorities. And people took the bet like, okay, we got through it, or he doesn't really mean it, or it's hyperbole, or I don't really care. We're going to find out. We're going to find out how far Trump can go and how comfortable people are living in that country.
So people didn't take the warnings seriously, or they're willing to live with them?
I think they did not. I do not think that a majority of the country has yet reached the point where they are willing to live with the rollback of civil liberties and civil rights and the kind of open integration of government with oligarchy that is possible. I think they still don't believe that's what they're going to get. And we'll see how much of it they get, how they react, and how much Trump is able to tilt the rules of democracy to make it less relevant how they react.
Ron Brownstein, it's wonderful to hear from you. I wish we had some more time, but thank you very much. It's been great to talk with you. And despite the fact that you are not giving us a positive view of what might be happening next, I don't know if you can.
I don't know if I have one. I don't know if I
Okay.
have one.
All right. Thanks again, Ron Brownstein, for being with us.
Thank you.
On Wednesday, next Wednesday, November 13th, we're going to hear from the Oath Keeper, Jason von Tottenhove, in conversation with my old friend Larry Mantle on the perils of extremism, how I left the Oath Keepers, and why we should be concerned about a future civil war. Not very optimistic next week either. Thanks again, all of you, for being with us. Take care and be well.